I have so many fond memories of playing Ninja Gaiden on the original Xbox. That was one of my favorite games of that console generation. And, there's been some high points and some low points in the series since then. But Ninja Gaiden 4, I'm hoping for good things. Now, there was a recently released Ninja Gaiden 2 remake, which was running Unreal Engine 5 and did have some kind of stuttering and performance issues on PC. And the thing is, though, Ninja Gaiden 4 does not appear to be using Unreal Engine 5. From my eye, as well as the research I've been able to do, this appears to be on an in-house Platinum Games engine. Now, I think that comes with some pros and cons. The visuals aren't really blowing me away, but this series is really about the gameplay to me. So the visuals look serviceable. Hopefully we get some excellent gameplay when this launches on October 21st. And one of the nice things about having maybe not absolutely boundary-pushing visuals is that a lot of people are going to be able to play this game judging by the system requirements. Because, if the, graphics are kind of mid, but, the performance is great, then, there's at least, the silver linings on that, right? Anyway, so it's looking like you only need a GTX 1060 as the minimum system requirement here. But a couple of notes. Some people might have the 3GB version of the 1060, which also did release. The 6GB version here is specifically listed. The AMD GPU they're listing is an RX 590 with 8GB of VRAM. That one may have also come in multiple VRAM capacity models. I can't quite remember. Now, that being said, though, this is for 1080p 30 FPS, and it's not actually native 1080p either, and it is at low settings. They are specifying FSR quality, which is internally rendering at 720p and then outputting to 1080p with a bit of an upscaling cost. So running natively at 720p would be a little bit faster. Now, I have some suspicions that this actually isn't really 30 FPS. Like a lot of system requirements lists, it might be more like, 40 FPS or so. In other words, don't read too heavily into this. But what this is really saying is that they've tested out these types of hardware and were able to get, a reasonable playable experience, but definitely not near 60 FPS. Now, I do want to mention they are saying an SSD is required. So if you are on an older system and maybe we're still using hard drives at the time, or at least for your games, etc., that could potentially be an issue. Now, most games that say SSD required can still run on a hard drive, but not always super well. Long load times, sometimes asset streaming issues and hitches. So, guys, if you don't have an SSD in your computer right now, honestly, that's going to be the best upgrade you could possibly do. You should really do that. Anyway, I obviously understanding budgets are what they are, but if you can afford one, get yourself an SSD if you haven't yet. Anyway, now let's take a look at the recommended specs, which are staying at 1080p using FSR quality, so still not even a native 1080p, but it's jumping up to 60 frames per second and going from the low settings to the middle settings, medium settings. And they're asking for the GPUs to jump up to an RTX 2060 Super with 8GB of VRAM or an AMD RX 5700 XT, 8GB of VRAM. Now, I want us to jump into a useful tool here. This is the Tech Power Up Relative Performance Chart. One thing this is useful for is if you, watching this video, don't have one of the GPUs specifically listed, and you don't have some encyclopedic knowledge of all of the graphics cards and how they perform relative to each other, this can give you a good ballpark idea. However, it is also important to note that the way these are listed here compared to how they perform in any specific game may or may not be exactly the same, but it at least gives us a rough idea of what other GPUs are in these general performance classes. It'll also help us speculate a bit out to what if we wanted to play it native 1080p or at 1440p or 4K, what kind of power levels might we need, etc. Anyway, so let's take a look here. If we set the GTX 1060 to 100% baseline, we can see that the RX 590 that they listed alongside as a minimum requirement is within about 11% of the performance on average. Those seem pretty well paired together. Now note some of these other GPUs that are in this same general performance tier might not have at least 6 gigabytes of VRAM. So if you're on like a 4 gigabyte version of the RX 480, which I'm pretty sure was out there, you might want to hold off on assuming everything's going to work. You might need at least 6 gigabytes of VRAM because they did specify that on the GTX 1060. So important to note. Anyway, as we scroll up here, maybe you're on a 1660, an RTX 3050. You can see that you're in roughly those minimum spec, ballpark, but maybe a little bit more powerful, getting a little bit more performance, or maybe backing off on the FSR and running it like a native 1080p. Now, as we scroll up, we'll see the RTX 2060, but do note that the system specs were specifically listing the 2060 Super. Now, one reason for that could be that little bit more performance that gets you, but another reason might be that the original 2060 was a 6 gigabyte card and the 2060 Super was an 8 gigabyte card. And the AMD GPU they listed for the recommended spec is also at least an 8 gigabyte card. So in other words, it's possible that going up to these middle graphic settings did require more than 6 gigabytes of VRAM. That's a little bit of speculation on my part, but important to note there. Because otherwise, the 2060 Super versus the baseline 2060 is not like a massive performance difference or anything like that. Anyway, so now notice though that the 2060 Super is listed here as not double the performance of a 1060. Here they're saying like 67% faster. However, I have noticed in some newer games with more modern engines, sometimes the performance here is blown out in favor of the newer architecture with the 2060 Super. So it is possible that it's a true doubling of performance, but this is one of the reasons, the fact that this is listed as about 67% more powerful, is one of the reasons why I'm thinking that the min specs might actually be better than 30 FPS, maybe 40 FPS or so, because you would expect to go from 30 FPS to 60 FPS at the same resolution and settings to require double the performance. But we're not only doubling the frame rate, we're also increasing from low settings to medium settings. So that should be an additional burden. So altogether, you would expect to maybe require double the performance, but it's not actually stating that based on the GPUs that they're listing here, which means maybe we're going from more like 40-ish FPS to 60-ish FPS. That's also pretty consistent with other system requirements lists where when they say 30 FPS, they don't always mean exactly 30. It's like ballpark, right? Could be 40. Anyway, so I would say that that's maybe a possible little ray of hope there on that 30 FPS performance, because honestly, 40 FPS feels a lot better than 30 FPS in a game that does require some, tight timings and things like that. Anyway. So that's where we're at here. Now, there's also CPUs listed. None of these are mind-blowing. It looks like for the 30 FPS requirement, an i5-8400 or a Ryzen 5 3400G, which seemed a little random to me, but okay. An i5-8400 was a 6-core, 6-thread processor from back in October of 2017. So we're talking what is that, about 8 years ago now, and it was kind of a mid-range chip from 8 years ago, so not asking for that much. The Ryzen 5 3400G was actually only 4 cores, though it did have 8 threads. And the G versions, while they have integrated graphics, they're clearly not using that, and they generally perform worse than the non-integrated graphics versions for reasons we don't need to get into right here. And that was a July 2019 chip and was, not super expensive or high-end at the time. Now, the recommended specs are jumping up to 60 FPS. Again, when you're thinking about CPU performance, don't worry so much about the resolutions. Some graphic settings have a bit of a hit on the CPU, but it's more about the max frame rate that you can achieve. So for those, they're actually only asking for a Ryzen 5 3600 or a Core i5 10400. Now, Ryzen 5 3600 is fairly similar in gaming performance to what we see in consoles like the PlayStation 5. So that would probably make a lot of sense for targeting 60 FPS mode in those consoles. It's a 6-core 12-thread CPU from back in July of 2019. So, 6-year-old mid-range part, and there were a lot of these sold. This was a really popular option at the time. So there's that. And again, the Intel Core i5 10400 also listed there as well. I'm going to end off with a little bit of thoughts on, so what if you want 1440p? What if you want 4K? What if you want higher frame rates, etc.? Well, that's where this tech power up relative performance chart is going to come in handy. So if we're on the 2060 Super, and this is getting us medium settings 60 FPS at not even native 1080p, remember that was with FSR quality, then I would expect to need a bit of a performance jump just to get to like a native 1080p medium. Maybe we're talking around the RTX 3060 or better. Maybe if buying newer cards, RTX 5050 or 4060. Seems like something I would expect, if we're talking the kind of performance gain you get from using FSR quality. I'm going to say that we'd want to be RTX 4060 ballpark, probably for that solid 1080p 60 medium. Again, if these specs are even accurate, again, let me know if you're interested in me benchmarking this thing. Now, from there, you could probably play at 1440p, but using like DLSS balanced, and get similar performance to native 1080p. That's how many engines and games scale, but not all of them. Some scale a bit differently with upscaling. So I think 4060 probably be reasonable there on that 1440p with upscaling and 1080p native. If you wanted that 1440p native performance, I think you would need to be even higher up from here. Maybe you're talking 5060 Ti's, 6800 XTs, 7800 XTs, etc. And then once you get into the 3080 territories, etc., I'd be imagining you'd be pretty good and getting even higher frame rates if you're using upscaling. Native 4K is pretty demanding on just about anything out there, even in lighter weight titles, but the super high-end stuff could probably do it. This game doesn't look super heavyweight, but again, I'd probably recommend using the DLSS or FSR there. Now, I don't see DLSS listed anywhere, but given that they're listing FSR as available, most games that would have FSR available would also have DLSS available. But in system requirements lists, they'll just list something that would apply to both, to all the hardware that they're listing here. Not all of it supports DLSS. Hopefully it'll have like FSR 4 available, but again, no specifics on that so far. So we'll have to see with all of that. Hopefully you guys found the video useful and or interesting. Let me know. I judge based on kind of how many views these system requirements videos get, combined with what the comment sections look like, to judge the interest on whether it's worth buying the game and benchmarking it on launch day. Again, comes out on October 21st. Hope all of you have an excellent day.